Thank you so much, everyone, for sticking around and for the, I guess it seems like a really crazy marathon that you're going through. So I appreciate being part of it. Thank you so much also for the invitation. My name is Nicolay. I'm an architect. I work at a non-profit philanthropic organization called REARC, where I co-direct the practice lab with my collaborator, Olga. Yeah, I guess I'm really excited to sort of share some of the work that we've been doing on our end. I think that the previous talk was really interesting, really inspiring, and also part of the things that we think about daily in our work, except perhaps with the key difference that we think about it at a very different point in the process. We still think about as a philanthropy where we're not directly involved with building buildings. We do talk about design from the point of view of how architecture is actually incentivized and funded, which is another form of design. And sometimes that doesn't really come across as a design project. I think that there's no shortage of education programs and design, instincts and design sensitivity and focus on the end goal of sort of the form making and of the kind of tectonic creation of buildings, but I think that there's equally important sort of emphasis that needs to be placed on a different point in the process, much more upstream, where we kind of think about the ways in which we structure the built environment, which starts with not only training better architects, but also training better clients, so-called, but I don't think it's the right word. So in any case, I'll share some of our work. Hopefully you'll see that it is quite complementary with the outcome, but we spend very little time talking about buildings themselves, although I'll try to share as well, if the time allows, some of the examples of the work that actually makes it out of the process. I guess also by way of introduction, I've been asked to kind of introduce myself a little bit. I also come trained as an architect, I guess, in a traditional sense. Actually, I've already been called. I already heard that I look like an architect. So that's also true. I spent maybe about the first decade of my career working in a kind of corporate environment, doing what a colleague of mine calls premium mediocre architecture. Basically, the best version of a bad thing. Premium mediocre, comes from premium economy. Basically, good, clean corporate architecture of this sort of the kind of initiation to buildings where you kind of think about the traditional instincts of giving form, giving shape to program and so on, working on very large institutional buildings, but really coming in at a very different point in the process where the brief has already been established. I also teach and I'm involved in various different para-academic institutions, namely until recently was co-directing the program at the Strelk Institute for Media Architecture and Design. I don't know if anyone knows about this or remembers that school. Essentially, it was an institute for media architecture and design where we really saw architecture and design as subsets of media. Essentially thinking about these disciplines as in architects don't make buildings, they don't make form, they actually make communication media for the production of space, whether it's in the form of plans, construction drawings, but also obviously narratives, sketches, and so on, and kind of think about the affordance of that media. It was also a highly multidisciplinary program where, again, our intention, implicit and explicit, was to, again, not train only designers, but train the ecology of people who are involved in the construction of the built environment. And as you can see, most of the designers, quote unquote, that we had were non-architects. The goal, of course, was not just to teach architects the skills of non-architects, but very much the other way around, teaching lawyers to think of their work as design work, teaching economists to bring some of the design instincts that architects have by education to their own sort of postgraduate sort of thinking. We also worked on an interesting kind of format where design research was a core component of our work. You'll also see it in a way when I start talking about our new organization, where we talked about kind of paradoxes or kind of contradicting currents that allowed kind of interesting ideas to emerge. In a case of sustainability or energy, one of our common themes, still very relevant to this conversation here, this kind of incredible rise of awareness of the kind of climate crisis in which we're embedded, with an incredible decrease in the scale of action where we can actually, be involved in, which is a real societal problem that our philanthropy tries to tackle. Similarly, the perhaps equally important, and I'll make probably many allusions of this today, this kind of incredible increase in the recognition and celebration and kind of promotion and talking about design in general, and its power and its responsibility and its agency, coupled with, I think, a tragic decrease in its relevance. These are kind of old Strelka kind of models which used to inform our work in these various different programs, which led to very different projects and up until publications that I just saw at the bookstore. So that made me happy. Unfortunately, the school is now closed. But we did migrate. The reason why I wanted to set this up a little bit, this kind of para-academic, in parallel to academia, doing things that traditional academia can't do, and there perhaps other institutions could do to not go against academia, but go complementary to, in parallel to. This is very much how we conceived of REARC, which is this philanthropic organization that we co-founded maybe about a little bit more than a year ago. It's basically a nonprofit that's funded by Interrogo, which it's a nonprofit in the space of architecture. It has something between 5 and 10 million euros a year to donate to architecture kind of related projects and organizations. It seems quite high when I say that, but it's actually negligible in the space of philanthropy. And most people don't know what the Interrogo Foundation is, but most people would recognize this, which is really Interrogo being the foundation that owns IKEA. I actually didn't know this before I started, but IKEA is not a public company. It has no shareholders. It's essentially a kind of private foundation that owns it. A lot of people think about IKEA and design in the context of furniture, but I think this is actually, it's important to think about this perhaps as IKEA's real design project, the kind of institutional ecology that allows it to exist. And I think we are inspired by that. On the one hand, of course, we are now a component of that ecology, a very, very small one, but still quite independent from IKEA. So important distinction, but also to kind of be inspired by this kind of ecological design, institutional ecology design, which I think really more designers should take seriously as a really critical part of kind of getting ourselves out of or contributing, I think, to the right things that we need to do in the context of the climate crisis, to think about these kind of institutional design projects as equally valid. So REARC as an organization really is a nonprofit that works at this intersection of climate action and architecture. We fund community-led solutions that address the root causes and consequences of climate breakdown and nurture this notion of the creative reimagining of the systems that need to be reimagined, typically with the lens on social and ecological, not as opposite, but really as kind of two sort of infrastructural systems that need to be designed with a close alignment. So not so much think about nature as this kind of pristine, beautiful thing that is kind of molested by architecture, but really think about a kind of infrastructure of support, a kind of umbilical cord at the scale of the planet that is infrastructural in nature, and therefore the social and architectural layer being essentially needing to be realigned in a much more serious and responsible way than they currently are. At a high level, we give grants in a very like a typical nonprofit, grants to nonprofit organizations, which is what most nonprofits can do. But I think what's interesting, and for example, we have many different sort of recipients. Some of them being small scale foundations, some of them being larger regranters, and so on. But doing kind of typical things that philanthropy does. Why I mentioned Strelka in the beginning and when I talked about this kind of para-academic lens is because also I think when we were presenting this project to IKEA or to Interrogo, we made the claim that essentially we want to also operate in ways that are slightly different from traditional philanthropies, given the fact that I'm not a philanthropist, I'm an architect, and all of our sort of co-founders and the very vast majority of our team does not come from a philanthropic background. So we try to introduce this idea of a para-philanthropic organization that does things in parallel to traditional academia, to traditional philanthropy, meaning that we do initiatives like various kind of cultural projects and kind of editorial projects around the building of discourse through this platform Revisions that you may have come across, as we're often in London. We have an upcoming event, I think, at the Whitechapel in the next couple of weeks. but predominantly also allowing ourselves the space for experimenting within the space of philanthropy, which is this practice lab, which is the one that I lead with Olga, where really our core focus is to really try to prototype different types of relationships between these two fundamental industries, architecture and the building industry, and the philanthropic industry, which is a design industry. It does design through incentivizing and funding. And therefore, these two have to be thought, I think, in a much, or at least there's an interesting opportunity to think of them as parallel, complementary design projects, which we're very excited to kind of spend our daily work on. In terms of our focus, it's actually not very original. It has to do with a very kind of blunt, and I think almost like sort of direct interest in this notion of climate change, not so much climate crisis, but just climate change, which is not a new idea. This is actually something that's been around for a very long time as a concept, 1975. But I think a core component of our work and of our kind of like mini internal manifesto, which we don't always share, is that we think of climate change not only as an ongoing process, but much more importantly as an ongoing project. This is, whether it's conscious or unconscious, very much a design project, which makes essentially the climate crisis a problem of labor, like a problem like what are we spending our time on? What are we spending our energy on? What are we spending our funding on? How are we shaping the crust of the planet and the atmosphere? And therefore, how should we be thinking about it? So it's a very different take, I think, from some of the more sort of moral narratives of climate change as a moral failure. It is partly that of a particular group of people who have known about this for a long time and haven't done much about it. But I think it is a societal problem of what are we actually doing? And therefore, what do we need to be doing, not just at a kind of personal scale, but also at a societal, at an industrial scale, which is also why we are interested in, and the word practice lab comes from working with practitioners. In essence, how do we work with the laborers of the built environment, which means many of them not being philanthropies, not being nonprofits. How do we work with non-nonprofits in order to do this? And again, to give a little bit of setup to this, we really try to frame this problem, the problem of the climate crisis, as it relates to architecture and philanthropy, as one where the last 400 years really, if you squint your eyes and think about everything great that architecture did in the last 400 years, you can really think about it really as, again, this is a oversimplification and very banal statement, but you can think about essentially us taking one molecule off the ground and putting it upwards, right? Like every building, every museum, every cultural achievement has actually been, in fact, part of a total mobilization societal project to move carbon up. And which is also why I like this quote, where when you start thinking about this and think about the fact that by weight, we've done more to transform the planet's atmosphere with carbon emissions than the planet's surface, it starts to kind of dawn on you that this is basically a gigantic collective landscape design project that we're all undergoing at industrial scale. Like everything that we do on a surface is much more visible, but really thinking about this as a project of labor, moving things up, is kind of our starting point, which is also why we want to focus on this, which is also why we don't like to use the word Anthropocene. This is probably a word that everyone here is familiar with, but from a theoretical standpoint, I actually don't think it's that useful. It's kind of misleading. It makes it sound like this is an era, an epoch, something that's been sort of happening or will be happening for a very, very long time, rather than something that's happening for a very short amount of time, which is really much more akin to a mass extinction. So we try to avoid the word Anthropocene, as one way or another will be soon in the post-Anthropocene, whether we're extinct or we move past this kind of human-centered view of the world. But in essence, some people call that project the Anthropocene, and that's fine. Many people call that the Capitalocene, which is also kind of probably a right framework. The Petrocene, I've heard. The Cthulhucene by Donna Haraway. We at the Strelka Institute used to call it the terraforming. It was our word for that kind of past 400 years, which basically allowed us to think about terraforming not as a verb, not as making Mars like Earth, but really the terraforming, so not Mars, not Elon Musk, that kind of stuff, but the terraforming as a noun, the process of designing and making Earth Earth-like, both as a kind of a non-conditional principle. Essentially, for the past 15,000 years, arguably, we've been terraforming, still not long enough to be a geological era, but still. And much more recently, this kind of unconscious or semi-conscious landscape design, highly irresponsible, highly non-viable, instant, like a flash in a pan, and therefore not an era. But I think perhaps all of these theoretical frameworks aside, the most kind of dry, but also maybe useful way of thinking about this is this kind of great acceleration project, the hockey stick diagram, where really the consequences of that unconscious project are actually really starting to get felt in a way that actually kind of triggers to think about, okay, what is the equally large industry scale? And that by that, I don't mean just industry as it is, but really societal effort that's required to move things in the other direction. Again, this has been a summer that we all know. And the reality of this kind of uneven distribution of negative impacts, but also consequences, is also starting to get really, really, painfully obvious. Hence, this notion that in the same way that the last 400 years required this kind of total societal mobilization, we need to start thinking as a society of the next 100 years requiring a similar total societal mobilization away from this kind of irresponsible project to a more viable one, and really thinking about it as the same scale of effort from all industries, except only faster and in reverse, which is again arguably something that are as a collective, as a planetary collective, we don't have any real references for that scale of action, which is again a real challenge, which I think we can all sort of feel as palpable. And that requires, again, not simply making architecture, it requires every single sector of our industry to be rethought in the next 100 years in order to prevent the most negative direct consequences. But the reason why, again, I use this as a bit of a segue into getting to philanthropy and architecture is because I think both of these sectors, both of these industries, knowing this setup, I think have a much more serious responsibility than the ones that are currently being sort of given. On the one hand, again, these are two important aspects of society that have their own internal narratives, their own internal kind of cultural, folklore, with their own sort of set of heroes, their own set of models, their own set of kind of, and again, these are two industries that don't really speak to each other. There's actually almost no real overlap between these two industries, which is also why the kind of the two main questions of the practice lab, as I'm slowly kind of segueing into this work, is what is the clear role for either of those things? Thinking about architecture not as frozen music, not as a calling, not as a labor of love, not as a kind of a formal exploration or a kind of a theoretical sort of overlaying grids on grids kind of poetic discipline, and definitely not as a ritual, religion or cult, as it tends to be sometimes. And on the other hand, thinking about philanthropy, which is something obviously very new to us, as I've mentioned, but that is also, again, we cannot think about philanthropy as charity. We cannot think of philanthropy as raising awareness about this problem 50 years on. We cannot think about this essentially as kind of building slogans and kind of inspiring people to do change. I think these two require a much more serious involvement, which means need a much more meaningful relationship between each other, which is basically what sets up the kind of question of the practice lab. And this is the kind of little diagram that we showed our funders. But in essence, that's kind of our mission, to kind of think about the climate crisis as a societal project that we are undergoing, and therefore need to revert at an equal scale of labor and involvement, active involvement, design involvement, and thinking about the role of architecture in that involvement much more seriously. Currently, philanthropy funds books, research, pavilions, charity, whether it's sort of organized or rich donors. But I think as an industry, it has to be taken much more seriously, which is the core of our research from a kind of theoretical standpoint. Hence the practice lab, which is also where we try to kind of develop research, develop collaborations, develop a way of thinking that trickles into the kind of grants and the kind of initiatives that we can support what are, again, 5 to 10 million euro budgets yearly. So the practice lab conducts, similar to the Strelk Institute, for those who know, very kind of highly based on research and kind of exploration and design, not at the formal end, but much more upstream, at the kind of the elaboration of the brief, the designing of the framing of the question, and then takes these kind of briefs and takes these experiments and works directly with site-specific practitioners. I don't use the word architects because they're not the only practitioners that deal with the built environment, to support and prototype new models for philanthropy in architecture. More specifically, what Olga and my work daily is basically about exploring alternatives to how architecture is designed, but in our language, that means incentivize and fund it. How does society incentivize and fund architecture? And how do we, at the practice lab at REARC, can create different ways of incentivizing and funding that would allow for very, very different outcomes? So that's kind of the big question, conceptual question, which I promise gets much more applied and pragmatic. But I think it's important to kind of start with that because I think it orients the rest of our work. To do that also, and I'm kind of sharing a little bit behind the scenes of our pitch process, which is also a design project, as I mentioned, architecture being a media discipline, designing these decks, designing these storyboards is definitely, I think, an active design. But we designed this kind of very simple 2x2 grid, which had to do, on the one hand, how we incentivize, market-based incentives and alternative incentives, agnostically, and on the other axis, how we fund and not fund, right? And that creates these kind of 4 different little universes. And you can think about plotting how essentially the built environment and both crust and atmosphere gets made across these 4 different quadrants. On the top quadrant, we have market-based incentives that are funded. This is traditionally spoken in kind of just plain language, the commission narrative. Like a rich client loves your work as an architect, can't wait to work with you, calls you on the phone. This kind of myth that we're all sort of been socialized into. But essentially, this idea of the commissions, public or private, this is really what kind of makes the bulk of the built environment in terms of incentivizing and funding. And again, it's not something that lacks funding. This is actually one of our most well-funded human activity on the planet. We spend, almost $12 trillion US, 13% of GDP. It employs 1 out of 11 people in the world building this world, building the terraforming, building the great acceleration. 7% of employment globally. And the reason for that, of course, as you probably all know, is that it's also, the built environment is the largest store of wealth that we have it's worth more than all other sort of worldwide stocks and securitized debt combined. It's essentially 3-dimensional wallets, which is also why we have the world that we have. This is why we build this way. Things that are realistic in a sense that they exist, but not at all in a sense of like, this makes sense. It also is why the ways in which we build that's the what. That's why there's actually very little incentive for the construction industry to change. It's one of the most conservative industries in the world, actually, in terms of how it builds with concrete, glass, fire regulations, and so on, are unlikely to change because there's no real incentive for them to change. And of course, it's also one of the most exploitative industries, as you probably know, not just from the point of view of the kind of the frontline workers who are working in conditions that are not at all, again, terrible conditions, but also from the so-called global north perspective, one of the industries where hopefully that's changed. I mean, I graduated maybe 15 years ago, but hopefully that's changed these days. But I've done my share of kind of, unpaid internships with my own laptop for the honor of working with XYZ celebrity that I can't name because it's recorded. But long story short, this is also why we have, architecture sort of conservatively, and I guess construction or the built environment conservatively is responsible for about 40% of CO2 emissions. Again, we use this figure. It's not at all the only damage on the planet. Arguably, it's maybe our most pressing one in terms of the kind of permafrost, the time bomb that we can talk about after. But essentially, it's a very dumb metric, which is very easy to explain to people. 40% of CO2 emissions come from this, and that's typically not something that non-architects kind of understand intuitively. People think about cars, they think about planes, they think about plastic straws. They don't think about buildings in the same way because it's not part of the cultural imaginary, even though it should. So that's the upper quadrant. On the lower quadrant, I kind of put nostalgically or tongue-in-cheek-wise competitions because as you probably have experienced or may experience eventually, like most competitions, not only do you not make money as an architect, you lose money. Even the ones you win. And therefore, I don't think that this is a sustainable business model that is worth preserving, but it's definitely market-based in terms of an incentive because, again, most of these competitions have a kind of a dual negative impact. On the one hand, they kind of sustain this kind of ideology of like the lone genius that usually a guy, usually someone that looks like this, wins, you know, through their kind of hard work and vision, the right, the permission actually, the permission to build to change the world. So that kind of, I think it continues to kind of perpetuate this kind of competitive model within the industry, which is a huge problem. And also from a competition a couple years ago, which is probably the most brutal example. I don't know if anyone remembers the Helsinki Guggenheim, but in essence, this was an open competition to celebrate creativity and innovation that received, almost 2,000 entries. Everyone did that competition in my generation. And collectively, not only did we not win, we actually produced $7 million of free labor for the Guggenheim, of free advertising, essentially, which again is not something that I think as a society we should be incentivizing in terms of kind of a way of working with the built environment. So long story short, that's why despite the kind of the tradition of charrette culture, the tradition of competitions in the built industry, I don't think that this is something that we necessarily want to focus on. And again, the question remains, what are alternative incentives to be designing the world from the point of view of the non-market based? We were very new to the space of philanthropy when we started, but again, not at all underfunded societal project. Not as much as the built environment, but still 750 billion in 2020. Those were the latest figures. That's a pretty big amount, but I was actually personally very surprised to find that within that amount, given the kind of the critical importance of the climate crisis, less than 2% of global philanthropy was going to climate change mitigation, which I think is actually shockingly low. And if you break down the numbers like we did when we started, it's an even smaller amount. It's basically 8% of that 2%, or 115 million, go to architecture. And that's assuming, again, that everything goes to the built environment. I'm sure that most of that goes to conferences and coffee table books. But again, a very small amount, less than, 1/100th of 1% goes to something that causes 40% of CO2 emissions. So clearly there's and this is also obviously part of the storyline for Interogo and IKEA to convince them that this is actually a very important space of activity, having a philanthropy that specializes in architecture. Basically less than 1/100th of 1% for something that causes 40% of CO2 emissions. And I swear we didn't cheat. We actually just got lucky with the commas. It's basically moving the comma 5 times, 1/1000th of 1% in terms of the funding. Again, the dumb metric, but in terms of the funding that we put within the construction, within architecture from the philanthropy industry, compared to what the traditional market. So again, this is obviously, on the one hand, a big problem. Another big problem, and again, we're being recorded, so I'll try to be kind of nice about it, but it is also that much of that focus, much of the non-market-based incentives that are going to architecture end up being pooled in kind of cultural projects of this sort, which are, nothing wrong with the Venice Biennale, but again, cultural production being the predominant recipient of this funding, right? Events, exhibition, the production of discourse, which is really, really important, but perhaps, overemphasized in that chunk. Again, the Venice Architecture Biennale is a fantastic format, and there's many other biennales. But meanwhile, it's kind of Venice keeps sinking, which is a bit of a challenge. And I was actually quite surprised to see how difficult of an argument it was to make, that what if we funded things that were not art projects? What if we funded things that are not cultural production? Because again, it becomes almost like the kind of de facto jump that this is what philanthropy is. Charity to celebrate things that are kind of in the realm of kind of culture entertainment. Nothing wrong with that, but perhaps not the only thing that philanthropy could be doing. So to kind of make that point a little bit internally, we built this kind of diagram where this is the Venice Biennale, one of the oldest kind of forums. And today we kind of sort of mapped this kind of incredible growth of architecture gathering moments, which again have had this really exponential explosion up until a point, mid 90s, as you can see, which again, just to put the hammer, like nothing to do with the climate crisis actually, because there's no real correlation, but I think there's a very real correlation with all sorts of other things that are happening in the world, namely things like the Bilbao effect, if you're familiar with this, but namely with the idea that architecture is kind of used as a device for real estate speculation to raise property values, things like the High Line, things like museums, things like honestly art fairs, as essentially a project that is very much not the opposite of market-based. Hence, this idea that maybe, another interesting graphic is this kind of the calendar year of these triennials, biennials, which kind of goes something like this, which means, of course, these don't go all at the same time, but really you could think about there's a kind of a circuit of going to festivals about architecture and going to exhibitions literally like every day of the year, sometimes in 15 different places at the same time, which again, nothing wrong with that. I'm part of these things. I'm going to Sharjah Biennale right after, so I'm not saying that this is something that I'm criticizing, but again, it's not the only avenue for funding and focus, and therefore it's kind of becoming a little bit of a habit that I think we need to be collectively stepping out of, this idea of sort of symbolic performance being the only contribution that architecture studios and designers should be making within the built environment. So kind of in a tongue-in-cheek way, which one in this meme, where is the architect, and which one of these figures is something that I think we need to be a little bit more conscious of, and obviously build systems that allow for a much more infrastructural focus rather than symbolic, semiotic, discursive, radical in a performative way focus. So long story short, to kind of finish my Foursquare, this is the sort of setup for the kind of work that the ReArch Practice Lab is actually interested in funding, which again, surprisingly, was actually quite a difficult sell internally, where we don't want to act like a traditional client, telling practices what to do, hiring them, even though we are working with non-nonprofits. Our challenge is to find ways of working that are not client relationship-like, even though we are giving the funding. We don't want to be giving out competitions. We don't want to give out prizes, personally. It's still an ongoing debate, but I think this is not necessarily the way to go. And we are not as critical as I just was, but not, let's say, focused on funding things that are purely discursive. So we don't fund research projects, we don't fund books, we don't fund exhibitions, not because it's bad, but because there's plenty of other avenues of funding for that. And I think actually much more cultural institutions and museums should be taking on that work. Therefore, we as a philanthropy, operating with this budget, what could we be doing that's not in these three quadrants is a little bit of the kind of the mission that we set up for ourselves, which is basically what are meaningful projects that are impossible, not only we don't do, but we can't do within these three other sort of boxes. Meaningful projects that are needed, but for which there is no traditional client. Some things need to happen in society, but there's no client to commission. And therefore we need to find ways of institutional ways of working, legal ways of working around that, which is why we're focusing mainly on also designing contracts. And obviously, meaningful projects that leverage very site-specific expertise, at a almost like hyper-local scale. So trying to avoid working with the kind of architects of kind of parachuting from context to context to build signature buildings. What are really site-specific expertises, both kind of, recognized and often unrecognized as expertises that we can recognize and therefore empower to shape the built environment with funding in order to address the kind of very real ecological crisis. Hence, these kind of much more meaningful relationships, as I said, not only help support the under-realized within philanthropy. Hopefully, I've made a point that there's lots of things that philanthropy is not realizing, things that we should do more of, like a much more direct involvement with the built environment, but also help support the not only unrealized, but also unrealizable within architecture. So not only things that we don't do, but often can't do. That's the mandate of the practice lab within REARC, and also how we conduct experiments. And because we've been around for basically almost exactly 1 year, we got our initial funding round October 2022. So it's actually almost exactly 1 year. Our first experiment we called not project-based funding, but practice-based funding, in order to think about, okay, what are very, very direct, very tangible ways that the practice lab can support practices to realize highly local, self-initiated, as in open brief. We hire them for them to tell us what they should be doing in their community, but also community-led projects where the community is not only involved, but also ends up owning afterwards. Because we, again, as a philanthropy, not a traditional client, cannot own these things, which is why we're trying to prototype a very different type of contract to do this. So what are projects that are site-specific and rooted in a very specific ecological social context? What are projects that can serve a very specific community, which will have to own them upon realization, which again is a challenging design project from a legal standpoint, which we're taking very seriously. Build on their existing body of work. If they work in Morocco, they work in Morocco, as opposed to, I've always dreamt of working in Singapore, for example. And also, very importantly, provide the potential for replicability, what we call blueprints in other contexts. This being, of course, the fact that architecture is predominantly a kind of, a precedence-driven industry. You need to basically do something in order to convince the next client that it's possible. And therefore, we're also really focusing on projects that are realized, that are not simply academic, that are not simply theoretical, projects that are done, that are sort of documented with kind of full transparency of the process and the budget, and therefore could be replicated in either similar or other relevant contexts to kind of produce this kind of scale, not by growth, but by multiplication. To build examples of the kind of architecture that we want to see in the world, so that beyond us as REARC, other philanthropies and maybe other private clients can get the fund. So we've developed, again, I'm going to not necessarily go over each step, but in the first sort of year, we've developed this kind of pretty intricate process with a legal advisor to kind of build this proposal versus realization phase of this kind of pipeline, this very different kind of legal structure where we commission, we pay, we literally out of the blue email offices, and with our Russian-sounding names, some of them think it's spam, but we're actually literally telling them we will give you 20,000 euros for you to present a project back to us that needs to be realized in your context, but cannot because there's no client to commission. And after a couple months of working together, we came back in front of our board, the Interrogo board, the REARC board, and we try to pitch for implementation, which is basically get the funding, which is about €250,000 to actually get the project realized. So it's a kind of pretty simple process. We conduct a lot of research with lots of different ongoing collaborators, build these kind of long databases, which is also the context of this invitation here today, which I'm very grateful for, this collaboration with the Non-Extractive Architecture Studio, which some of you, with Space Caviar, which some of you also may be aware of, where Sophia is obviously one of the partners there, but also a former Strelka researcher, which we kind of knew from back in the day. Essentially, after commissioning them to help us to kind of retrieve some interesting studios and practices that we should be talking to, it became very clear that their research and our research were actually quite complementary. So we kind of partnered together to basically build this online database, this kind of online directory of non-extractive architectures, kind of mixing our two kind of brands, to discover offices and organizations that are working in ways that don't fit maybe these three other boxes that basically we can work with and commission to do this. So essentially making this public. And I'm not sure if the press release is already out, but it's currently not officially out, but it is, I think, already online. It should be online this week or publicly, where we have these different categories. But in essence, we build these kind of different, selection criteria, and we shortlist, from about 700 to 100 to 20 down to 8 practices per cycle. And over this past year, we've done 2 cycles of practice-based funding, which means that we're working directly with 16 offices around the world. As you can see, some of them you may be familiar with, very kind of, I think, hopefully conceptually present in the UK context, such as material cultures, but also many of them in the global south, again, quote unquote, because I'm not sure if it's the right framework, but in geographies that are obviously at the front line of the climate crisis, but also where very pragmatically, giving our sort of still relatively small budget of a quarter, 250,000 euros per project, you can do a lot in Argentina with 250,000 euros as opposed to London. So it's not so much that we're discriminating against the global north, but it's just from a pragmatic standpoint, the most sustainable building in Copenhagen, where we're based, or the most sustainable building in London, doesn't matter if Latin America continues to be sort of shedding biodiversity loss. And so we're trying to basically act in geographies which are more impactful, which is a very kind of a popular word in philanthropy, as I'm learning. So these practices, again, we shared this brief with them, and we sort of made this agreement that we are hiring them for the first phase, where we give them this kind of initial funding to 20,000 euros, and they present this project to us, and then we, along with their documentation, their video, and so on, we present it back to our funders in order to try to get it realized. And I'm just very happy to say that actually so far all of our projects have gone through. Again, not official yet, as we just had the meeting, so don't tweet about it. But we are doing essentially 16 projects around the world with very different types of collaborators, all of which were originated for a very specific, standardized brief. But because again, these projects and these practices know their local geography much better than we do, none of these projects I think we could have come up with at all, which is also kind of the point. We provide the funding, but it's not up to us to say what should be done at the periphery of Mexico City, in Delhi, and Thailand, and so on. So essentially, these projects are also very, very different from one another, but hopefully they're also building to the idea of a coherent typology of projects. Essentially, we're building not only 16 different projects, and hopefully as we go through more cycles, more and more of these projects, but we're actually building through a type of project, a type of project in that fourth quadrant, in order to normalize that fourth quadrant, which is, I think, back to our conceptual kind of narrative in the beginning, a really, really important part of this, that the goal is not to be radical. The goal is to create an alternative common sense, and therefore these projects have to be made commonsensical in order for them to kind of work in unison to hopefully not just inspire, but actually lead other foundations to take on a similar role as we start to open source our templates, our legal templates, because it's actually quite complicated to do the due diligence around this process, which is, I think, fundamentally the real design project. I can also go through a couple of examples if you promise not to share them online. One of them, I think, is actually really good. I mean, all the 16 projects are, I think, really, really exciting. But I think some of them are just much more directly or much more literally showcasing this kind of embedding between the social and the ecological. And it starts with this one, which is basically a project by Terra Capital in Mexico City, or actually at the periphery of Mexico City, which is basically a soft water management infrastructure, which not only harvests kind of rainwater runoff, essentially it's a big reservoir, but essentially creates a public space not in downtown Mexico, but at a very small, kind of slightly forgotten, politically forgotten periphery where, again, I don't think that I would have ever discovered this project site, but the practice, which is at Terra Capital, had already worked with them, and hence when we called them, they immediately thought about, okay, we have a very specific community which could really have a really immediate need for this. So what they basically propose is working in this context, San Lucas Xoloc, which they sent us a photo and it said this is kind of what it looks like now, but most of the time it actually looks like this. It's completely flooded, partly because, as you may know, the kind of Mexico City, there used to be a huge lake, no longer there, but water essentially naturally runs down this natural slope. But as there's a new airport that's being built in Mexico City, it's preventing the water from going down, and therefore it floods this really forgotten small city at the outskirts of the airport, which again is not large enough to be a powerful political bloc to do something about that problem. So the local municipality doesn't necessarily have any incentives to commission in the upper quadrant something about it. But nevertheless, it's a very real problem, which means that this is how it looks. And also, in order to mitigate this, the local authorities are essentially forcing the community to basically build this actually highly unsustainable system of drainage pipes that they're also charging them for. So they will have to not only pay for the building, but also pay for the use of the pipes in order to drain their own community, which has been flooded because of the airport that was kind of imposed on them, which again, a very real pragmatic problem, which should have an architecture solution, but falls through the cracks in the traditional frameworks with which we commission designers. So obviously their concept was very simple. How do we retain and use the water on site in a way that avoids this kind of drainage system, which is expensive and unsustainable. So they proposed, I think, a very kind of interesting, and this is also why I like this project, because it makes this kind of meeting of social and ecological almost like painfully obvious, as in there's a very specific axis where water runs down. There's a very specific public axis which needs to be activated. And therefore the project basically lives at this intersection kind of dumbly, where they are building this reservoir which not only collects the water, but also filters it and allows to create public functions around for the local community. So activities for kids, but also cooking and so on and so on. So again, a very simple program, very budget conscious, using local materials on a local site that's owned by the community, which makes it very easy for the community to own the project afterwards. So we provide the funding, they provide the expertise, the community ends up owning it. But again, because these projects are also highly community-led, the designers throughout the 3 months of the first phase have worked very, very closely with the community in order to also determine, what are social aspects of this that could be added? What are social needs that could be addressed? And hence the project takes on, I love these drawings, but takes on this kind of much more, let's say, it disappears within the landscape as it sort of makes it clear that the blur between architecture, landscape design, nature, infrastructure is all blurred. This is what I meant by a realignment of our technical systems with our ecological systems, being quite unromantic about both. They didn't try to fetishize the act of the architecture. They didn't try to fetishize nature as this kind of pure, pristine thing that's being molested. They just thought with common sense, how do we integrate the project across both, which is what made it interesting. And again, I won't have time to go through every project, but these have a very similar sort of take on this idea of like infrastructures of kind of planetary realignment between architecture and landscape. This is another project that we funded, that we just got approved by EVA, Emerging Vernacular Architects, that are also based in London, but working from Morocco, where they worked with a local Berber community, not too far from the epicenter of the earthquake, to basically build this, again, kind of terraced sort of project, which provides social functions at every level, but again, ultimately uses kind of century-old techniques for water retention and drainage to build these kind of 3 slope terraces to kind of act a bit as a machine for the landscape. Again, I like these projects because is this landscape design, architecture, or infrastructure? It's unclear, which is kind of the point. Similar with another project in Mexico, Water Intelligent Hub. As you can see, a lot of these have to do with water. It's clearly something that is of, it's another discovery of the process that the themes emerge from the practices as opposed to from us. We're not trying to impose a program on them, but there are definitely commonalities. This is a project by ORU, a very young office of urban resilience, which basically focused on restoring this kind of building shed up in the mountains of Oaxaca, which also again has an infrastructural function of dealing with water while working with the local community to activate with program, as well as another one here in Thailand, which had to do again, Pava, also another very young office. I should also say that the way that we choose the offices, we're not trying to privilege young versus old, or we're just simply trying to kind of find a good mix of, let's say, more traditional practices that are actually interested in building, versus more experimental offices that are interested in kind of pushing the boundaries of community participatory engagement and so on, as well as kind of, I don't want to say young and old, but emergent, established, experienced versus growing. The goal is also to give some of these practices their first portfolio project that they can then start showing and then starting to replicate. So this is why also maybe some of the practices are younger than we are, but they also proposed a really interesting project for, again, a local community which isn't really even formalized. It's these kind of local bikers that kind of use this road and have this kind of pit stop where they rest, and also address this kind of really specific sectional condition of this really stupid highway that cuts across this kind of biome and prevents this kind of the not only the drainage but also the kind of ecological corridors that are being interrupted, and working with the site, working with a hydrologist to kind of build a much more soft kind of landscape edge, which obviously we are funding an aspect of, like a short section, but the idea is basically to build a prototype which then could actually be scaled across maybe the entire length of the highway. So these kind of projects acting a little bit like first steps in the process, and so on. Finally, as I'm probably at the limit of my time here, maybe just the last project I want to share is this project by Région Astrale, which is a practice, really fantastic practice in Argentina, who basically had a very specific community. They wanted to focus on, the most vulnerable people in the most vulnerable spaces, which is usually climate migrants in informal settlements. Informal settlements being really, really interesting because on the one hand, the state has no incentive in acting on them because they're informal. There's no profit incentives to work in them, and therefore they kind of don't get addressed. But obviously, the families which live within them are eager to. It's not a temporary settlement. It's a place that basically needs to be designed for the needs, which basically needs to include them in the process. So they basically went through a process that Olga calls actually participatory design on steroids, where they had these kind of 4 different sites and worked essentially with this really, really admirable, because I'm sure it wasn't easy, kind of direct democracy process of like making sure that every community that's being affected by every site has a real role in the design process and basically make sure that their concerns are met. Chose sites with them, 4 different sites across the informal settlement, and are currently, this is one of our projects from our first cycle, so they're currently in the process of design documentation, getting ready to start building these sites. Once again, the goal of this is obviously to build. It's not simply to kind of make it as a narrative, but the narrative part is important, and therefore we're also funding the blueprinting, the kind of the storytelling, the story of the project, which is now essentially material that not only validates our work to our donors as an impact report, which is very different from the one they're used to receiving, but also could serve as a template for replication. Whether other organizations funding Région Astrale, us funding other practices that can work like this using this document, or other practices being inspired by other philanthropies to do the same. So this is kind of where I also want to end with my last slide here, that these projects, again, are obviously standalone and have their own importance. All work within this kind of 4th quadrant should be less controversial than it currently seems to be. And the fundamental kind of, I think, project of the practice lab, because again, we're not trying to claim the credit for the work. The work is the practices work. We're essentially acting a little bit like an ATM for them. We are funding this. But we're also trying to kind of change this linear kind of client-led process, which is typically kind of a pipeline, from specific client with a specific need and therefore money, hiring an architect, which is so-called expert, working for users that are kind of the passive receptors, to basically changing this relationship where we at REARC are kind of working like a client, but not really. We're providing the funding, but we're not the client. The architecture practice is not simply a provider of services. They actually leverage their own expertise to kind of think creatively, like the project in Mexico, about a smart, often much cheaper solution and much more sustainable solution. And therefore, we recognize their expertise in the process and making this kind of abstract notion of a community, which we can all agree that is a good thing, but when it's said in general terms, no one really knows what it means. Make it much more specific, grounded, and make sure that there is a local involvement by them in the design process, so we can build this kind of three-way contract, which is very, very different from the linear contract that we have inherited from the 20th century. So this is why it's also a last slide, because I think the fundamental project of the practice lab, it's our first year, but as we're growing and don't want to jinx it, but hopefully also scaling our funding, we will be working on more of these projects, but also blueprinting the legal pipeline, which we will also then share with other foundations in order to normalize a building process that is very different from the one that we currently have. So I think I sort of made it on time with my pace of speaking. Thank you, thank you very much.
Thank you. I think it was a wholly admirable project that you're doing. Do you have time for a few questions?
Yes, of course, yeah. Oh, if I could say just one last thing as a kind of a shameless promo. We are also obviously working with researchers around the world with sort of internships, paid internships, and kind of research arrangements. So if anyone's interested in kind of getting involved with us, either at REARC or Practice Lab, please do so. That was my little sort of moment, like and subscribe moment. Yes?
Hi, fantastic presentation, really exciting work. I was wondering about the timescales you were thinking of for how you judge the kind of success of the project, and often the landscapes. The success of them is in the maintenance and the long-term use of them. So I just wonder about how you think about these timescales, which could be quite long and, I guess, intensive. Yeah.
This is a really important, great question, and really important question, because it's also kind of where our main, let's say, challenge lies within the context of traditional philanthropy, which is basically very impact driven. It's not an accident that philanthropy doesn't really address architecture. It's because it's actually notoriously hard to assess impact of the built environment within the cycles that are incentivized by the philanthropic industry. Like if you can't prove impact right away, you're actually not really, it's risky to take on a philanthropic project, which is also why there's so many kind of symposia and conferences, because you can very easily count the people who attended and liked, and therefore it's metrics for impact. But in terms of how we're approaching this, we have identified different phases of the project. We have essentially the kind of the research and kind of development phase. We have the realization phase, which we're currently embarking with 8 of our 16 practices that have already been approved in April. And the third phase, which we need to kind of embark when some of the projects get done, is the afterlife phase, which is basically making sure that we haven't created a burden for the community that is now responsible for this, which is also why it's very important for the practice, as they're working with the local collaborators who end up often receiving the funding, to kind of work an arrangement either with a municipality. In the case of Argentina, for example, there is a kind of a 4-way agreement between REARC, architects, foundations, and the kind of local governments to kind of make sure that the maintenance costs are taken accounted for. So that's one thing, making sure that it's not a burden. On the other hand, making sure that the project is successful in terms of impactful, that's much more difficult. But we're hoping that, again, we can not be the ones that judge this and basically think about working with the practice in a kind of a afterlife context to maybe help us understand the sometimes non-quantifiable impact that these projects have in a community, so we can actually make them quantifiable in a different way, so we can actually try to reinforce some of them in different ways. So that's not a great answer, but it's still where we're at in the process.
Hi, Nicolay. And you've thought a lot about the planetary and how do we position ourselves in the planetary. I know that's what you've been thinking of for the last decade or so. And so the question to you is, now Practice Lab and REARC is placing itself also very interestingly in terms of governance model. Where does local government enter and leave, and when do you enter? And so I'm questioning, you have institution that is international, and so that means you have also this cross vision of what are priorities, so to say, in the planetary level, and how can you implement that into a very local level. So I'm questioning for you more your personal take onto how do you place yourself between government and local population, meaning that you also have this kind of more planetary objectives that you want to achieve.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. That's a great question, and it's also, I mean, yes, at Strelka we talked about the planetary in a much I can talk theoretically about this a long time, and maybe that's more of a drink conversation. But just to remind everyone, I think everyone knows that the planetary is not very, very big. It's this kind of trans-scalar. It's essentially from the atomic to the atmospheric and back, not just in space but also in time. So planetary scale doesn't mean simply very, very large. In fact, it is kind of grounded very, very specifically at the atomic level, at the municipal level, and all other levels in between. So with REARC, which is again a much more pragmatic project than Strelka ever was, I think we try to distinguish, or at least this is a personal answer, and I should also have said that all of this I'm not speaking on behalf of REARC, this is kind of views my own. I'm not even trying to put Olga into this as well, but if you have any answers, it might be different as well. But in terms of the difference that I think is important to think about between the governance and the political, is that there are some very real political realities on the sites which we're working with. And for all sorts of reasons, both sort of real and sometimes kind of sort of perceived, there is a lot of risk aversion for philanthropies to be working with political difficult contexts, just to put it mildly. So the way that we've tried to not bypass but respond to that is basically by making a difference between the political, like politics and governance. Politics is human sort of negotiation and kind of the realignment of priorities and kind of the decisions that need to be made at a communal level. Governance is how things are governed, which means infrastructure has that governing effect. Like you don't vote for your tap water to come up every time, but once it's baked into society, it is a political decision that governs society. So as a philanthropy, I think we're trying to focus more on the governance aspect as opposed to the political aspect, which is basically why we're prioritizing infrastructural projects that have a political reality, which isn't celebrated as political because it's kind of invisible, but again, protocols and norms and standards and laws are political and they do govern our lives. As a philanthropy, we can have, and as a philanthropy in architecture, we do have, I think, a very real power in addressing governance at local scale, which ends up having very real material political effects above it. So again, it's more of an academic answer, perhaps more Strelka than REARC. But the REARC answer to this is that if we focus, again, not on being sort of like flamboyant, like performatively radical, as a kind of making statements, and we just kind of sneak in the governance through the projects by, again, making them appear commonsensical. Of course, these two axes, as they connect, of course, they make a reservoir, which of course does this. It's actually much easier to get much more radical projects in the door than if we sort of made a poster about it and sort of demanded change from the airport municipality that has had this negative effect on this local site.
We have one last question, please.
Hi, thank you. Is it working? Okay. Thank you for your presentation. It's really inspiring. As I understand it, you don't really allow pitches and you don't get people pitching things to you. You kind of do your research and ask people to do a project proposal. Could you elaborate on what the process of selection and what would someone do in order to stick out, I guess, from the crowd?
Right. Thanks. Again, also a really critical question, and I think there's two answers to that. So one of them is just pragmatically, I don't think we're ready yet as an institution to be receiving open calls, both because we don't have the community of expertise to assess proposal in the same way. We have informal processes that obviously work. We have a I think pretty thorough selection process that's internal, and we do have sort of advisors that help us to do that. In terms of kind of helping us think through priorities, but we're not ready for an infrastructure of open calls yet, like the Graham Foundation or other foundations. But eventually we will have to develop that, because I'm assuming that we will get sort of people calling us out of the blue. Our selection process currently has to do with a couple of factors. Also, maybe Olga, if you want to jump in, you can do that because you've been much more involved. But I think that it has to do with, on the one hand, the profile of the practice in terms of the portfolio of projects that they have already actually realized that maybe they don't have to be at the same scale. Like, it's not like a traditional client which will require you, when I was an architect, like, what are the 5 last mega hospitals you've built before you can build this mega hospital? But more like, what are the kind of principles that have been materialized in your work that we can sort of assume that you will build upon? It has to do also with, obviously, there's a due diligence process like any other process with, there's a transparency of a budgeting sort of structure. And I think the proposal is also judged by it's not so much that they respond to a problem, but they're also like an opportunity to do something that, again, would not be done in the 3 other quadrants. Like, we try to really prioritize projects that are impossible to realize within these other 3 quadrants that I described. So I think it's a big criteria to think about. This is an experiment, so we're trying to kind of develop to develop the typology of projects that we want to realize. We have to start developing the typology of practices that we want us to commission. So some of the criteria that we have to do with experience, have to do with local site and local need and local community, have to do with the ability to, like, you have already an existing relationship with the community. It's not something that has to start from scratch. And ultimately also has to do with the idea of being able to replicate, like, the blueprintability of these projects. Is this a one-off fantastic pavilion? Or is this something that basically sets the blueprints for the kind of architecture that we need to be multiplying in the world? And actually we put a lot of weight on this. What is the principle here that once abstracted could also be repeated? And just as a maybe teaser or open to ideas from everyone, but maybe a part of our open call process is less about receiving the proposals from the first, but maybe to receive proposals for replication. We have realized something, and then maybe offices apply to try to realize the same thing, but in a local context for which we could provide the funding. So that's maybe a way of kind of going around that. But again, this is all work in progress until October 2024. Thank you.